just to begin our conversation for today, Lars, I would like to share a quick overview of the concept of the carbon emission tax on the shipping, and basically how it aims to address the climate change on a global scale. If you can just give a broad overview for our audience to understand about this topic.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give a good grand overview, because from my perspective and what I've seen also come out of the latest IMO meeting, this is going to sound slightly harsh, but I see nice talk and intentions, but not very much tangible action. And this is not necessarily to levy huge criticism at IMO. We need to remember, what is IMO? IMO is a collection of basically all countries in the world. And here we get to what I think is the root of the matter. The moment you start talking about carbon tax, you are effectively also aiming at a system whereby not all, but most large countries in the world need to agree not only on some sort of, call it common taxation, but also some sort of common ground to enforce this. And I have a hard time seeing the realism of such an approach actually getting into action. If we were to look at it slightly differently, let's make two different examples to compare this to, both in terms of a carbon taxation and also in terms of enforcement. In terms of carbon taxation, the only one we have right now, de facto, that is up and running is in the EU, the Emissions Trading Scheme, or ETS as we know it. That is de facto a carbon taxation. Does it work? To some degree, yes, because all ships that do go in and out of EU, we have had for years, they have to report their emissions. You have the same legislative environment across the EU, and God knows even the EU at times have a hard time finding common ground for all the member states. So finding common ground globally is going to be even more difficult, but at least it is there. But it also shows some of the challenges. Some of the challenges here are, what are the ways with which to, I wouldn't say cheat the system, because it's not cheating, but you could make port calls close to the EU and thereby reduce the reportable emissions for one element, for example. So it is there. It is being implemented. You are seeing shipping lines on the carrier side trying to implement surcharges to pass on the cost. So it can be done, but it is exceedingly difficult to get common ground. And then we also come to the enforcement part. Assume you broaden a different type of carbon tax out globally. Would you necessarily enforce it in the same way in terms of how do you measure, where should I pay? And here comes the critical question, who gets the money? And again, if we are being slightly honest here, yes, there will be money paid for the carbon emissions certificates in the EU, but you can then question, what is that money actually being used for? This will be an even greater challenge globally, where I could see a number of challenges related to who should get to administer this money. Does it go into a global IMO pool? Does some of it go to US, some of it to China, some of it to India, some of it to EU? I don't see a practical political solution on that. What I do see, however, is why don't we learn from something else completely? Let's forget carbon just for a split second and look at low sulfur. It was recognized now almost 20 years ago that sulfur emissions were also a problem, not from global warming, but this was a health issue. And what we came up with, as we all now know, was the limit for sulfur from 2020. And that is enforceable it's very simple to enforce, because basically it's an extremely simple matter. You can go on board, you can inspect the vessel and ask the question, do you have low sulfur in your tanks or not? If you do, then that's fine, you're compliant. If you don't, the next question is, do you have a functioning scrubber on board? If you do, then fine, you're compliant, otherwise you are not. That is relatively easy. Setting up a system whereby you have to measure, let's say, again, stay with the sulfur emissions. If somebody had proposed, why don't you measure your sulfur emissions along the journeys, report this in, and we'll look at it. That would be a much more complicated way of doing it. If we try to make that parallel over to carbon emissions, the challenge then becomes one I think is fundamental to the decarbonization of the industry. What are the realistic fuels that we have?
Yeah.
And right now, obviously, there is not a lot of zero carbon fuels out there. It will gradually come. I'm not sure it's going to be expanded as rapidly as everybody would like it to be. But that might be a viable path going forward. Say there is a long phase-in period. And over time, there will be requirements to the fuel specifications itself. There can be transitional periods. There can be periods where there's a mandatory inclusion of biofuel. Some of that will de facto come out of the EU 25 rules coming in 25, for example. But that would make it somewhat more enforceable. And the reason I keep harping on this enforceability is this is a global industry. And I say that because it seems to me, at least sometimes at the political level, they tend to overlook what this means. That means that this industry has spent centuries perfecting how do you choose the legislation that applies to you. And the industry is extremely adept at doing so. That goes also for normal taxation purposes. It goes for purposes of what kind of crews do you need on your ships? And in the more, let's say, cynical parts of the shipping industry, what are the safety standards you need to adhere to on the ships? The industry is extremely adept at choosing the legislation that suits their purpose. So if we try to go down a path of making a global carbon taxation that is not completely effectively enforceable, that have gaps because not all countries are part of it, you will see some shipping lines definitely use those loopholes. The problem that creates is you will then skew the playing field. Suddenly you will have a massive commercial disadvantage to the companies that actually do try to decarbonize. That brings up yet another question. Again, this is a whole web of different stakeholders. Because often when we talk about decarbonization, we tend to talk about the shipping lines, the ship owners, the ship operators.
Yeah.
Very rarely do we talk about the other extremely important stakeholder out there, the shippers, the customers themselves. And I can only speak from the perspective of container shipping because that's my experience and my expertise. What I have seen in recent years and what I still see to this very day is, by and large, across the board, there is essentially no willingness to pay for this. A slight caveat, sure, you can find some individual customers that are willing to do it. There are some customers that pay a slight extra for having, for example, biofuel. There are some customers that do want to pay for something, but they are by far in the minority. And the reason I'm raising that one is linked with what I just said before. If we end up with a system where shipping lines that do want to decarbonize get a commercial disadvantage because the ones that don't care and choose a legislation where they're effectively exempt from this, in a commercial environment where shippers to a large degree are unwilling to pay, that is a problem, because then the shipping lines that try to do the right thing are effectively penalized and could lose part of their market share. That is extremely problematic. That is why I think an approach where this becomes enforceable, like, for example, a low sulfur fuel, which is much easier to enforce, might be a more viable path, because that makes it much more difficult to also try to avoid some of the penalties that might occur for not being compliant.